The afternoon light came through the bakery windows the way it always did in October, sideways and golden, catching the dust motes suspended above the display cases, making even the ordinary look briefly consecrated. Ember and Crumb sat on the corner of Harlow Street, and forth the kind of small business that survived in a changing city, not because it was trendy, but because it was true. The floors were original hardwood dark with decades of foot traffic. The glass cases held things made by hand. The smell was butter and brown sugar, and something underneath both of those things that had no name but felt like childhood. Nora Harlan sat at the corner table by the window, the one with the iron legs and the small nick in the tabletop edge that she had traced with her fingernail every time she came here, which was not often enough. On the table in front of her sat a white cake, not large, not decorated beyond a smooth layer of frosting, with 22 candles arranged in 2 neat rows. They were lit. They had been lit for approximately 4 minutes. The wax was already beginning to run. She did not blow them out. The chair that would have sat across from her had been pushed against the wall by the previous occupant, and no one had moved it back. Nora had not asked them to. The space felt accurate. It matched the interior of the afternoon, which matched the interior of the year, which matched, if she was being honest with herself in the way she rarely allowed, the interior of the 4 years that had preceded this birthday, and the 4 that had preceded the accident that had made the word birthday feel different in her mouth. Heavier like a stone she kept swallowing. Her phone sat face up on the table beside the cake. The notification had arrived at 11:47 that morning, while she was in the accessible shower of the Harlan estate, running hot water over shoulders that still held tension, the way old wood holds water completely stubbornly without visible sign. The notification was from her bank. A transfer of $5,000 from the Harlan Family Trust, initiated by Aldous Harlan, CEO of Harlan Systems, majority shareholder of 4 subsidiary companies, and categorized last on a list that had once appeared first, her father. The memo line read, "Happy birthday, Nora." There was no message. There was no call. The candles continued to burn. She was 22 years old. She had been in a wheelchair for 4 of those years following a collision on the interstate outside of Raleigh on a Friday night in November, when a man named Douglas Greer, who had a blood alcohol level of 0.19 and a suspended license he had not mentioned to the rental agency, ran a red light at 63 miles per hour and took the front third of her car with him through the intersection. She did not remember the impact. She remembered the moment before it, the particular green of the traffic light above her, a song on the radio that she had been about to turn off because she did not really like it, but had left on anyway because she was tired and the drive was long and making decisions felt like too much effort. She remembered the decision not to decide. And then she remembered the ceiling of a hospital room, white and institutional and absolutely still, and a doctor's voice explaining that her spinal cord injury was complete at the T11 level, which meant translated out of clinical language and into the language of a person who was 22, and had not yet finished understanding what her body was capable of, that she would not walk again. Her father had been in that hospital. She knew this because Geraldine, the day nurse, who had become something like a confidant over the 10 weeks of Nora's inpatient rehabilitation, had mentioned it once quietly in the way people mention things they think you already know. "Your father was here every night the first week," Geraldine had said, adjusting the IV line, not looking up. "In the family waiting room mostly. Talked to the doctors a lot." Nora had filed this information carefully, the way she filed most things that hurt. Not discarded, not examined, simply placed somewhere interior and load-bearing where it could do its structural damage slowly and without announcement. She had not been awake the first week. By the time she was consistently conscious and oriented, her father had restructured his presence from the hospital hallways to the conference rooms of Harlan Systems, where the business of managing his daughter's accident, the liability suit, the insurance negotiations, the architectural consultation for the estate renovations that would make it wheelchair accessible could be conducted with the efficiency he applied to every problem that arrived on his desk. He was good at problems. He had built a company on the premise that every system given the right intervention could be optimized. Nora had become a system. The candles had burned down to roughly half their original length. One of them, the third from the left in the back row, had developed a slight lean and was dripping onto the frosting. Nora watched it. She had a thought, not for the first time, that the only thing more depressing than a birthday cake with unblown candles was a birthday cake with unblown candles that were visibly dying on their own, resolving the whole situation through attrition. She almost laughed. Almost. The bell above the door of Ember and Crumb was a small brass thing that produced a sound more delicate than its size, suggested a two-note chime that Opal Gentry, who had owned and operated this bakery for 27 years, had chosen specifically because she wanted people entering her establishment to feel welcomed rather than announced. The distinction mattered to her. It mattered now when the door opened and the bell did its small work, and the man who entered was 30 years old and carrying in his left hand a paper bag with the logo of the craft supply store 2 blocks north, and in his right the hand of a girl who was 5 years old and already talking before she had fully cleared the threshold. His name was Beckett Merritt. He was 5'11", built through the shoulders in the way that came from actual physical labor rather than a gym membership, with hands that showed their history. The small scar along the left thumb from a chisel that had slipped 3 winters ago, the permanent stain of walnut finish along the cuticle of his right index finger, that no amount of scrubbing fully removed. He wore a flannel shirt the color of pine needles, dark jeans, work boots that had been cleaned but not recently. His face was the kind that took longer than a glance to understand, not conventionally remarkable, but arranged in a way that suggested patience, or perhaps the particular kind of stillness that develops in people who have survived something large and learned to live in its aftermath without being defined entirely by it. His daughter's name was Wren. She had her father's dark hair and eyes that were something else entirely. Lighter, quicker moving over everything in the bakery, with the comprehensive attention of a person who had learned early that the world offered details worth cataloging. She wore a yellow jacket over a striped shirt, and she was telling her father with considerable urgency about something that had happened at school that morning involving a caterpillar, a lunchbox, and a sequence of events that had apparently stunned her entire class into silence. Beckett was listening, not performing. Listening. Actually, listening. His face angled toward her, his pace adjusted to hers, his responses arriving at the right intervals. A question here, a sound of genuine surprise there. It was the quality of his attention that Nora noticed first before she noticed anything else about him, because it was the thing she recognized as rare without being able to articulate exactly when she had learned to recognize its rarity. They were 3 steps inside when Wren stopped talking about the caterpillar. She stopped because she had seen Nora. More specifically, she had seen the cake the candles guttered now to small flames barely clearing the frosting, and the woman sitting alone in front of them. Wren's hand tightened in her father's, and she pulled once, a small, urgent tug, and leaned up toward his ear. Beckett listened. His eyes moved to Nora's table. Something in his expression shifted, not pity, which Nora had become expert at identifying and which she was already bracing for, but something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. The particular look of someone who has sat in a similar shape of aloneness and remembers what it felt like from the inside. He said something to Wren low enough that Nora couldn't hear it. Wren nodded with her whole upper body. Then he walked toward Nora's table. She watched him come. Her first instinct, trained by 4 years of navigating a world that frequently treated her wheelchair as either an obstacle or a conversation prompt, was to arrange her face into the expression she used for unwanted interaction. Polite, closed, faintly, discouraging. But something about the directness of his approach, the absence of the particular hesitation that usually preceded pity-driven intrusions, made her wait. He stopped at a conversational distance. He did not crouch down to be level with her, which people sometimes did with a kind of performative consideration that she found more disorienting than the alternative. He simply stood and looked at her with those steady eyes, and his voice, when it came, was warm without being cloying. "We were wondering if we could join you. My daughter would like to wish you a happy birthday." 4 years of birthdays marked by bank transfers and brief texts. Paid staff who were kind because kindness was in their job description. A rotating cast of therapists and medical professionals who cared genuinely, but within defined hours and documented sessions. And before that, the birthdays she could not think about without something in her chest doing what glass does when it's been struck, not breaking exactly, but ringing with a frequency that wasn't comfortable. She heard herself say, "Sure." Wren needed no further invitation. She appeared at the table with the speed of a child who had been waiting for adult negotiations to conclude, and she placed directly in front of Nora a cupcake she had been carrying in a small paper bag, white frosting slightly lopsided with a silver star-shaped candle pressed into the center. "I made it with Daddy this morning," Wren said with the matter-of-fact pride of a person delivering something of obvious value. "It has vanilla inside and also some sprinkles, but they're on the inside because I put them in the batter and Daddy said they might melt, but they didn't. Not all of them." Beckett pulled out the chair that had been against the wall and sat down. He did it without making a production of it, without the small performance of asking if it was okay to move the chair, which would have made the whole thing feel like a negotiation. He simply sat unhurried as if there were no correct way to spend a Tuesday afternoon in October except this one. "I'm Beckett," he said. "That's Wren. We come here every year on this day." There was something in the way he said every year that carried weight he wasn't explaining. Nora filed it. "Nora," she said. Wren had already positioned herself beside Nora's chair, not in the remaining seat, but standing at the particular proximity that children establish when they have decided someone is interesting and have not yet developed the adult instinct to disguise their interest as casualness. "How old are you?" Wren asked. 22. Wren considered this with appropriate seriousness. "That's a lot of candles," she said, looking at the cake where the 22 candles had now burned themselves to stubs, several having gone out on their own. "Did you make a wish?" "Not yet." Wren looked at her father. Something passed between them, the kind of wordless communication that develops between a parent and child who have spent significant time alone together learning each other's frequencies. Beckett reached over and relit the remaining candles with a lighter from his jacket pocket, the cheap kind from a gas station dented at one corner. He did not explain why he had a lighter. He simply lit them all the way around with the focused attention of someone performing a task that mattered. When he finished, the cake was lit again. The wax was newer now, or at least the flames were, and Wren began to sing in the slightly off-key soprano of a child who has not yet learned to modulate for an audience unself-conscious and therefore perfect. Halfway through the second line, Beckett joined her, his voice a low baritone that had no particular beauty but a great deal of sincerity, and together they filled the small corner of ember and crumb with enough warmth to make Opal behind the counter look up from her work and simply stand still for a moment. Nora closed her eyes. She had not made a wish on a birthday candle since she was 18 before the accident, before the year she had spent at the University of North Carolina studying art history, before an interstate intersection rearranged the entire topography of her future. She made one now. It was small. It was, in fact, embarrassingly small for a wish, the kind of thing that should have been a given that in another life would have been too ordinary to articulate. She wished not to be alone anymore. Not in the way she had been. Not in the managed, compensated, professionally staffed way that was loneliness dressed in cashmere. She blew out the candles. In the weeks that followed, the three of them developed something that did not have a name in the early stages and did not need one. They met at Marsh Creek Park on Saturday mornings, where the path along the water was wide enough for Nora's chair and where Wren had discovered on their second visit that the particular stretch of bank near the old oak had ducks that were willing to be bribed with the end pieces of the bread loaf that Beckett always forgot to eat before it went stale. Wren would narrate the duck interactions with the comprehensive detail of a naturalist who had not yet been taught to abbreviate. Beckett would listen and occasionally contribute a question that made Wren's eyes go wide with the realization that there was more to consider. Nora would watch them and feel something happening in her chest that she did not immediately have language for. Beckett's workshop was a converted space behind a row of older buildings on the east side of the city, a former machine shop that he had taken on 5 years ago when the rent was low enough to be possible, and the bones of the building were good enough to be worth the work. He had told her about it on their third meeting at the park, not describing it as an achievement but as a place the way people describe places they have inhabited long enough to understand. The smell of walnut and cherry wood in the mornings, The way the light came through the south-facing windows in winter, low and long, making everything cast shadows that helped him see the grain of the wood more clearly. The workbench his own father had built, which he had moved to 3 different cities before it finally stopped moving. He did not talk about Anna often. When he did, it was in the way that Nora would come to recognize as his particular style of grief. Not the raw, destabilizing kind, but the kind that had been carried for long enough to have been smoothed by handling. He spoke of her the way you speak of a place you loved, and cannot return to with warmth, with loss, with the particular peace of someone who has stopped fighting the fact of an absence and learned instead to live in its shape. Anna Merritt had been a kindergarten teacher at Millbrook Elementary. She had believed with a conviction that Beckett described as both charming and occasionally inconvenient, that every child who walked into her classroom was capable of more than they or anyone else had yet imagined. She had painted the walls of their apartment, their first apartment, the one in Durham before everything, with murals. Enormous, sprawling murals of forests, where the trees had faces, where the paths led somewhere the painter had not yet decided. She had been pregnant with Wren when the complications began, and she had faced them with the particular courage of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep it regardless of what the circumstances say about the wisdom of that decision. She had not survived the delivery. Wren had. And Beckett had stood in the hallway of Durham Regional Medical Center at 3:17 in the morning and understood in the full and crushing way that understanding sometimes arrives not gradually but all at once, like a structural failure, that everything that came next was going to require him to be 2 things simultaneously broken and present. He had chosen every day since to be both. He did not tell Nora all of this at once. It came in pieces, the way true things do, fitted into the spaces of conversations that were ostensibly about other things, about Wren's recent obsession with origami, about the dining table he was building for a client in Raleigh, about the particular difficulties of working with figured maple, which was beautiful but unforgiving. Nora found herself telling him things in return. This was not typical for her. She had a therapist doctor, Cassandra Webb, who was excellent at her work, and for whom Nora had enormous professional respect and almost no emotional access. Their sessions were productive in the clinical sense. She could discuss the accident without dissociating. She could name her grief without being submerged by it. She had learned over 4 years to speak about her life with the controlled fluency of someone who has rehearsed difficult material until it could be delivered without breaking. What she could not do in those sessions was surprise herself. With Beckett, she was frequently surprised. She told him about the art history degree she had been in the middle of when the accident happened. The specific focus of her thesis, the role of negative space in Edward Hopper's work, the deliberate emptiness, the way Hopper understood that loneliness was architectural. She told him about the professor who had told her 3 weeks before the accident that she had the instincts of someone who would eventually produce original scholarship. She had not yet decided whether to believe him. She never got the chance to keep deciding. She told him about waking up in the hospital, not the medical facts she could recite, those cleanly had recited them to more people than she could count, but the specific quality of that first conscious morning. The ceiling, the sound of the ventilation system, the understanding which had arrived before any doctor explained anything that something fundamental had changed, and the person she had been making plans for was a different person than the one who would have to make new ones. Wren, with the impeccable timing of children, would interrupt these heavier moments at exactly the right intervals, dragging Nora into whatever game or observation or urgent question had captured her attention. She wanted to know if Nora could reach the highest branch of the oak by the creek if she stood on her wheelchair. She wanted to show Nora the origami crane she had made from a piece of paper she found in her father's truck. She said with the earnest gravity of a person who has considered the matter carefully, "I think you're going to be one of my best friends, Miss Nora. I've decided." Nora looked at this 5-year-old who had decided and felt something move in her chest, like water under ice, not breaking through yet, but present, pressing alive. One afternoon 4 weeks after the birthday, they were at the coffee shop on Prescott Street that had become a secondary location for their increasingly complicated map of regular places, and Wren was absorbed at a corner table with a new origami book that Beckett had produced from the paper bag. The craft store bag she realized now that he had been carrying the afternoon they met which meant he had planned to give it to Wren that day, which meant October 14th was a day he prepared for. She filed this too. Beckett was watching Wren work, and Nora was watching Beckett watch Wren, and then he looked up and caught her watching, and for a moment neither of them looked away. The coffee shop went on being a coffee shop around them, the espresso machine, the low music, the two women by the door laughing at something on one of their phones. None of it mattered particularly. His hand moved across the table. His fingers barely touched hers, just at the edge, a contact so restrained it could have been accidental, except that nothing about Beckett Merritt was accidental. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice low enough that it was only for her. "Wren and I aren't here because we feel sorry for you. We're here because you make our days better. Both of us. You make us better." Nora's eyes filled. She did not try to hide it, which was itself unusual. She had become practiced at the strategic management of her own emotional responses, the careful calibration of what she permitted to show. But something about the plainness of what he had said, the absence of performance in it, made the management feel like the wrong response. "I don't know how to do this," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. "Neither do I," Beckett said. "But I think we could figure it out. If you want to." She wanted to. She was aware with a clarity that she usually only experienced in retrospect that she wanted to very much. What she did not know, what neither of them knew yet, was that on that same afternoon in a high-rise office 11 blocks north, a man named Aldous Harlan was sitting behind a desk the size of a small country and reading for the second time a report prepared by a firm called Vantage Investigative Solutions, whose letterhead featured a small eagle and the tagline, "Clarity. Discretion. Results." The report was 43 pages long. It contained, among other things, the name Beckett Merritt, his age, his address, his business registration documents for Merritt Custom Woodworks, his annual reported income for the previous 3 tax years, a summary of the circumstances of his wife's death, a note on page 31 that Merritt had a minor daughter in his sole custody, a series of photographs taken at distances that suggested the photographer had not wished to be observed of Beckett and Nora at Marsh Creek Park, at the coffee shop on Prescott, at Ember and Crumb. In several of the photographs Nora was laughing. Aldous Harlan had not seen his daughter laugh in 4 years. He had not, if he was being accurate, seen his daughter at all in any meaningful way in 4 years, not because he was absent from the same building, but because he had learned in the weeks after the accident that looking at Nora required looking at what had happened to her, which required looking at what he had failed to do about it, which was nothing, which was the whole of his failure. He had provided everything. He had provided doctors and nurses and accessible architecture and physical therapy and the best rehabilitation facility in the state. He had provided everything that could be sourced, contracted, and billed. He had not provided himself. He understood this in the same way he understood other things he had no intention of changing, clearly distantly with the practiced remove of a man who had learned to treat his own emotional life like a subsidiary that was underperforming but not yet worth restructuring. The photographs on his desk showed his daughter laughing in a coffee shop with a carpenter, and a 5-year-old Aldous Harlan placed the report face down on his desk. He sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the surface, feeling the grain of the mahogany which had cost more than Beckett Merritt made in 3 months. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out his phone and typed a single message to his head of security, "I want daily updates." He did not examine why the photographs made his chest feel the way it did. He was 60 years old, and he had built his entire adult life on the principle that the things that made his chest feel wrong were problems to be solved rather than experiences to be had. Beckett Merritt was a problem. His presence in Nora's life was a complication. His daughter, who had not laughed in front of him in 4 years, was laughing in front of a stranger, and instead of sitting with what that meant, Aldous Harlan reached for the only tool he had ever trusted. He reached for control. What happened next happened on a Thursday, exactly 6 weeks after a girl with 22 candles sat alone in a bakery corner, and a man walked toward her table with his daughter's hand in his, and a question that should have been small but wasn't. Aldous Harlan arrived home at the estate, the 8,000-square-foot property in Westfield Hills that had been renovated after the accident to accommodate every possible need and had been doing so clinically and expensively ever since, and he summoned Nora to his study. The study was a room she avoided. It smelled of leather and old paper and the particular atmosphere of rooms that have been used for decades to make decisions about the world without the world being present to weigh in. The monitors on the wall displayed real-time market data. The shelves held business texts and a single framed photograph of Aldous' late wife Miriam, which faced the window rather than the desk, as if she were looking out rather than in. Nora wheeled into the room and stopped in the middle of it where the Persian rug ended and the hardwood began, and looked at her father, who was standing behind his desk with his jacket still on, which meant he had not been home long, which meant this conversation had been scheduled before he arrived. He did not offer her a seat she was already in. He looked at the tablet on his desk and then at her, and when he spoke his voice carried the particular register he used in hostile situations controlled, measured the vocal equivalent of a door that is very firmly closed. "You will end your association with the Merit Man, immediately. I won't negotiate on this." Nora heard the words. She processed them, and then, with the same clarity that had visited her in the coffee shop, the clarity of knowing what she wanted, which had been so long absent from her life that it felt almost foreign. She felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was made of both of them shaped into something harder. "The Merit Man," she repeated. Her voice was quiet. The quietness was not calm. Aldous moved on. He was presenting the situation as he had assessed it: a working-class individual with limited means and significant circumstantial motivation proximity to a vulnerable young woman with access to a substantial family trust. The conclusions were obvious. The protective course of action was obvious. He would handle the legal dimension if necessary. "He doesn't know about the trust," Nora said. Aldous continued as if she had not spoken. "I've never mentioned it," Nora said. "His daughter decided I was going to be her best friend because she thought I was alone at my birthday. That was the entire basis of the conversation." Aldous looked at her for the first time since she had entered the room. The look was the one she remembered from her childhood, not unkind but assessing. The look of a man who is reviewing information to determine its accuracy rather than receiving it to understand another person. "You've been isolated," he said. "You don't have the context to evaluate." "I have been isolated," Nora said, and the words came out with an edge that surprised even her. "I've been isolated for 4 years, in this house, which you filled with every possible professional and not yourself. So perhaps don't cite my isolation as a reason to trust your judgment about what's good for me." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Aldous Harlan had not in 60 years been spoken to this way by his daughter. He had also not in 4 years spoken to his daughter about anything that was not logistical or administrative or filtered through the professional buffer of her care team. They had lost the practice of each other. They were standing or sitting in the ruins of a relationship that had once been something else, and neither of them had the architecture for what came next. "If you continue this," Aldous said, "I'll take legal action. I'll pursue a claim that he's in proximity to you under false pretenses. I'll bury his business in litigation he cannot afford to defend." His voice did not rise. It was worse that it didn't. "Is that what you want for him?" Nora sat in the center of the room in the wheelchair that had been the axis of her life for 4 years and felt the trap. She knew with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent her childhood watching her father operate that his threats were not bluster. Aldous Harlan had destroyed people with more resources than Beckett Merritt using less motivation than this. The image of Beckett's business, the converted machine shop, the workbench his father had built, the craft supply bag with the origami book for Wren, caught in the machinery of her father's legal apparatus, was something she could not bear to hold in her mind for long. She left the study without another word. She sat in her room for an hour. She sat with the particular weight of a decision she did not want to make, which was also a decision she already knew she would make because the alternative was watching something she had not yet fully named get destroyed by the one person who had never been able to see her clearly. She sat with the origami crane that Wren had given her at the park 2 Saturdays ago, which she had put on her nightstand, which was the first object another person had made for her and given her from a place of pure wanting to that she could remember in a very long time. She picked up her phone. She typed the message. She sent it before she could turn it over again in her mind and find a reason not to. "I can't see you anymore. Please don't contact me. I'm sorry." The words felt like something breaking that had only recently been repaired, like walking on a bone that had not finished healing and feeling in the sudden white sharp moment of it exactly how fragile recovery is. She put the phone face down on the nightstand beside the crane. In the fixed stillness of the Harlan estate, 22 years of a life that had been managed and compensated and professionally tended sat with her in the dark, and the thing she had wished for on 22 candles 6 weeks ago, the thing so small it was almost embarrassing to have wished for, felt in that moment further away than it had on the night she had wished for it. She did not know yet that it wasn't. Beckett read the message 3 times, the first time for the words, the second time for what the words were arranged to conceal, the third time because he was hoping without real conviction that the meaning might shift if he came at it from a different angle. It did not shift. The message was what it was. 7 words and an apology, which was a particular kind of ending, the kind that had been written by someone trying to make a clean cut and finding that clean cuts still bleed. He set his phone on the workbench and picked up the piece of cherry wood he had been shaping before the notification arrived. A table leg, 1 of 4, for a commission from a retired schoolteacher in Cary, who wanted something her grandchildren could sit around at Thanksgiving for the next 50 years. He ran his thumb along the grain. The wood was good. The work was good. He put it down again. The message had not come from a woman who wanted to end things. He had sat across from Nora enough times in enough unguarded moments to know the difference between a person withdrawing by choice and a person withdrawing because something outside them had applied enough pressure to make choice feel unavailable. The message was the second thing. He was certain of it in the way he was certain of grain direction before he touched a piece of wood, a knowledge that preceded the evidence, but was not therefore wrong. But certainty was not a plan. He turned off the work lamp and went inside. Wren was asleep, which she always was, by 8:30, with a consistency that Beckett privately considered one of the more reliable facts of his current existence. She slept on her back with her arms at her sides, which Anna had also done a parallel. He tried not to lean on too hard, because the weight of it, distributed over the length of a childhood, was more than he wanted to calculate. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the way parents stand in the doorways of sleeping children, which is less about checking on them and more about receiving something, the specific reassurance of their continued breathing presence in the world. He went to the couch. He did not sleep. In the morning, Wren came downstairs in her socks and her pajamas with the small foxes on them and found him sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold still in his work clothes from the night before. She climbed into the chair across from him and looked at him with the level, undeflected attention that was one of her primary characteristics. She had never learned the adult habit of looking sideways at difficult things, and Beckett had, with full awareness of the irony, been doing nothing to teach her. "Daddy, why do you look like that?" He told her the truth, trimmed to what a 5-year-old could hold. Miss Nora had said she couldn't see them anymore. He didn't know exactly why. It might change. He didn't know that either. Wren processed this with the gravity she brought to things that deserved it. She was quiet long enough that the refrigerator cycled on and off in the silence. Then, "But she loves us. I know she does. She smiles different when she sees us. Real smiles, not the ones people use when they don't mean it." Beckett looked at his daughter across the kitchen table and felt the particular ache of watching a child be right about something. Wren had not yet learned to doubt her own perceptions in deference to whatever the adult world preferred to believe. She saw what she saw and reported it without apology. He had spent the past 6 years trying to raise someone with exactly this quality, and now it was sitting across from him in fox pajamas and confirming what he already knew, which was not comforting so much as it was clarifying. He spent 3 days respecting the message. It was the right thing. He knew it was the right thing in the same patient, reluctant way he knew other right things that cost something to do. He went to work. He picked Wren up from school. He made dinner. He did not look at his phone with more frequency than was reasonable, which was its own form of discipline. Wren stopped singing around the house. She did not announce this or comment on it. It simply happened the way light changes in a room when a cloud passes over the sun. Not dramatic, just a shift in the quality of what was present. She colored at the kitchen table in the evenings and asked her father twice whether he thought Miss Nora might change her mind, and both times he said he didn't know, and both times she accepted this without argument, which was somehow harder to witness than an argument would have been. On the fourth day, Beckett was picking Wren up from her after-school program when she asked from the back seat in the careful voice she used when she was working up to something she wasn't sure how to say, "Daddy, is it because we're not rich? Is that why she doesn't want to see us?" A pause, and then the question underneath the question, the one she had been carrying since the morning she found him at the cold coffee. "Is that why Mommy left too?" He pulled the truck to the side of the road. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the middle distance where the late October light was cutting through the trees at the same low angle it always did this time of year, indifferent to what it illuminated. Then he turned in his seat so he could see Wren properly, and told her with the precision the moment required that her mother had not left. Her mother had died, which was different. Different in every way that mattered, and the most important difference was that dying was not a choice, and leaving was, and Anna had never chosen to go anywhere that didn't include the people she loved. And Nora, whatever was happening, whatever the shape of the situation was, had not left either. Not in her. Something else was happening. Wren looked at him with those light, quick eyes. "Then we should go find out what." He could not in good conscience argue with this. They drove to the Harlan estate that evening in the last of the light Beckett in the truck's front seat, with the particular internal weather of a man who has made a decision and is not entirely comfortable with it, but is committed to it in the way he was committed to most things, not lightly, not with an exit strategy. The estate was in Westfield Hills, a neighborhood where the property lines were measured in acres rather than feet, and the landscaping was maintained by people who were paid to make it look effortless. The gate at the entrance was iron-black substantial in the way that things are substantial when their primary function is exclusion. The security guard was polite, which was its own kind of dismissal, the professional courtesy extended to people who are being turned away with the minimum of friction. Beckett was not on the approved entry list. He had not expected to be. He thanked the man and pulled the truck to the side of the drive just outside the gate, where the iron bars were spaced wide enough for a 5-year-old to press her face between them. Wren called for Nora. Her voice carried across the property in the evening air with the particular carrying quality of children's voices which cut through the ambient world without effort. She called 3 times, and then she called again, and then she stood with her small hands wrapped around 2 of the iron bars and said to whatever distance held Nora, "Miss Nora, we miss you. Daddy said to respect what you asked, but I'm only 5 and I don't think that rule applies to me yet. Please come back." On the second floor of the main building behind glass, a figure appeared in the window. Beckett saw it before Wren did the shape of a person in a wheelchair at the window's edge, not fully visible, as if someone had come close to something and then stopped. He did not wave. He did not perform the moment for whoever might be watching. He stood with his hand on Wren's shoulder and let his daughter's voice do what it was doing, which was being true, which was the only useful thing available. What he did not know, could not see from the driveway, was that Aldous Harlan was standing at a different window on the same floor. The CEO of Harlan Systems, who had negotiated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had restructured companies and redirected markets and operated for 3 decades on the principle that every situation had a leverage point, if you were patient enough to find it. This man was standing at his window watching a carpenter stand at his gate with his 5-year-old daughter. And something in the image was doing something to him that he did not have the vocabulary for and would not, for some time, be willing to examine. Beckett was not demanding. He was not performing. He was just standing there, hand on Wren's shoulder, waiting, not with the waiting of someone who expects to get what they came for, but with the waiting of someone who has decided that showing up is the point, regardless of outcome. Aldous had spent 40 years in rooms where everyone was waiting for something from him, waiting to leverage his attention or his capital or his influence, and he had become very good at identifying the angle of every approach. There was no angle here. That was what confounded him. He turned away from the window before he had to name what he felt. Beckett drove Wren home. She fell asleep in the back seat before they reached the highway, as if the expenditure of that much hope had simply used her up, and he drove the rest of the way with the sound of her breathing and the highway lines passing under the truck, and the night doing what nights do when you are in the middle of something you haven't resolved. The next morning he drove to Ember and Crumb. He went there because it was the beginning of the thing, and when you cannot move forward and cannot stand still, you return to the place that held the beginning, so you can think about what comes after it. Opal Gentry was behind the counter when he arrived, as she always was in the mornings, doing the methodical work of a person who has organized her days around the same good tasks for long enough that the tasks have become a form of devotion. She was 65, with white hair worn up in a clip, and reading glasses that she moved constantly between her face and the top of her head depending on what required focus. She had been watching Beckett and Nora for weeks, with the quiet attention of someone who runs a place where things happen and has learned to distinguish the things that matter from the things that just take up space. She put a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked, and then she came around from behind the counter and sat across from him, which she had never done before, and looked at him with the reading glasses on her face rather than her head, which meant she wanted to see him clearly. "You look like a man who drove somewhere last night and it didn't go the way he thought," she said. He told her. Not everything enough? Opal listened the way she made coffee with full attention and without interruption, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. She had known Aldous Harlan for 30 years. Not well. They had been in proximity to each other through the early years of his career when he was building Harlan Systems from a 2-person operation in a rented office, and she was running this bakery, and the neighborhood had been the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names because they needed to, rather than because they chose to. She had watched him become what he was, which had taken in her accounting approximately 15 years, and cost him approximately everything that wasn't the company. "He wasn't always the way he is now," she said. "People talk about Aldous Harlan like he was made cold. He wasn't made, he got there, and most of the distance was covered before that girl was ever in that accident." A pause. "He lost his wife 6 years ago, Miriam. They were one of those couples that run so deep in each other that when one goes, the other doesn't know which direction is up anymore. He kept functioning. He'd built his whole identity on functioning. But something went out." Beckett listened without speaking. "The accident gave him something concrete to manage," Opal continued. "He's good at managing. He's not good at the other thing. And I imagine standing next to that girl looking at what happened to her felt like standing next to the clearest possible evidence of everything he'd already failed to prevent." She looked at Beckett steadily. "I'm not defending him. I'm explaining the terrain. You strike me as a man who needs to understand the terrain before he decides what to do about it." Beckett looked at the coffee cup and then at the window and then back at Opal. "When Anna died," he said, and the name came out with the particular weight of a word that has been carried for 6 years without becoming lighter. "I wanted to stop. Not in a way I would act on, but in the way of wanting the world to pause long enough for the inside of me to catch up to what had happened. I had Wren, so I couldn't stop. But I understand the instinct to run toward the thing you can control." Opal nodded. "The difference between you and Aldous," she said, "is that Wren made staying necessary. Nora never could make herself necessary to him in the same way. She was too much like Miriam, and looking at her was too much like looking at the loss." The information rearranged itself in Beckett's understanding. He was not a man who easily reconfigured his positions, but he was a man who respected evidence, and evidence was what Opal had given him, not the exculpatory kind that let Aldous off the hook, but the explanatory kind that changed the dimensions of the problem. This was not a story about a cold man protecting his property. This was a story about a frightened man who had never learned to be afraid and present at the same time. Beckett had learned that. He had learned it in a hospital hallway at 3:17 in the morning 6 years ago, when Anna did not come back from the delivery room and Wren did, and he had stood in the corridor understanding that everything that came next was going to require him to be two things simultaneously broken and present. He had chosen every day since to be both. It had not been a dramatic choice. It had been the ordinary daily choice made in the kitchen and the workshop and the truck and the school pickup line, accumulating into something that looked from the outside like strength but was from the inside simply the refusal to let grief be larger than his daughter's need for him to show up. He drove to the Harlan estate that afternoon with Wren, and the sequence at the gate repeated itself: the polite security guard, the iron bars, Wren's carrying voice in the autumn air. But something was different about his own internal weather. He was not there to retrieve something. He was there because showing up was what you did when you understood the terrain. You showed up and you let the other person see that you were not going anywhere, and you let that be what it was, which was either enough or it wasn't. On the second floor, Nora appeared at the window again, this time fully visible. She sat in the frame of it looking down at the driveway, and even at that distance Beckett could see the quality of the looking, the particular expression of someone watching something they want and cannot at present reach. Her hands were in her lap. She was not moving toward the window or away from it. She was simply present in it, suspended between the thing she was afraid to lose and the thing she was afraid to choose. What he could not know was what was happening behind her. What was happening was this: Aldous Harlan had come home from the office 40 minutes early, which he did not do, and had found Nora in the upstairs hallway near her room. She had turned her chair and looked at him with an expression he did not recognize, not the careful neutrality she had maintained for 4 years, not the managed pleasantness she deployed with his household staff, but something rawer. The expression of a person who has been sitting with an injury and has stopped pretending it isn't one. He had looked at her. She had looked at him. And in that hallway, with the afternoon light coming through the east-facing windows at an angle that made even the expensive ordinary look briefly sacred, something cracked in the careful architecture of their mutual avoidance. He told her it was for her protection. He told her that she had been sheltered, that her understanding of the situation was incomplete, that he had information she didn't have and was acting on her behalf. He said the words he had prepared because Aldous Harlan prepared for conversations the way he prepared for acquisitions, thoroughly and with predetermined outcomes. Nora let him finish. Then, "You watched me sit alone in that bakery on my birthday?" Her voice was absolutely level. "I know you were there. One of the kitchen staff mentioned seeing your car. You sat outside and watched through the window, and then you drove away and you let me sit there alone, and now you're telling me you're protecting me from the man who decided I shouldn't be alone." Her hands folded in her lap. "I'm not naive, Dad. I'm lonely. There's a difference, and I need you to understand that the thing you're protecting me from is the only thing that has made the last 6 weeks feel like I'm living in my own life." Aldous stood in the hallway. He held the things she'd said the way you hold something whose weight you were not prepared for, not dropping it, but not pretending it was light either. That was when the sound of Wren's voice came through the window, clear and carrying and entirely certain, saying Nora's name into the early evening air like it was a fact that needed confirming. Aldous watched his daughter move toward the window. He watched her face change, watched the suspended quality give way to something more urgent, more pained, and he recognized what he was watching because he had felt it himself once, before he had learned to bury it under the management of everything else. He was watching his daughter choose between what she loved and what she was afraid to lose. And the choosing was costing her, and the cost was visible in every line of her face, and it was costing her because of him. He left the hallway. He did not go to his study. He went to his wife's room, the room that had been Miriam's, and that he had not significantly changed in 6 years, because changing it had seemed like a concession he wasn't willing to make to the fact of her absence. He sat in the chair by her window, the one she had used to read in, and he sat there with the lights off and the darkening sky outside and the distant muffled sound of Wren calling for Nora from the gate. He had a photograph on Miriam's nightstand, not the framed one in his study that faced the window, a different one, smaller, in a plain wooden frame that Nora had made in a high school craft class and given to him for Father's Day when she was 15. In it, he and Miriam were at a picnic table somewhere, he could not now remember where, which bothered him more each year, and they were both laughing at something outside the frame, and Nora, who must have been 13 or 14, had caught them in the middle of it. It was the only photograph he had of himself laughing in the last decade. He picked it up. He looked at it in the failing light with the reading glasses he never let anyone see him wear. He looked at the man in it who was 44 and laughing at a picnic table, and felt the distance between that man and the one sitting in this chair like a measurement he did not want to take but could not stop himself from taking. Miriam had told him many times, and with the gentle persistence that was her preferred form of honesty, that he worked too much. Not as criticism as information offered, because she understood him well enough to know he needed things stated plainly to act on them. She had been right, as she had been right about most things, and he had not acted as he had not acted on most of the important things she had tried to tell him until acting was no longer an option. He set the photograph down. He sat in the dark of her room and thought about Beckett Merritt, not the 43 pages of the Vantage report, not the income figures and the business registration and the annotated photographs. He thought about the gate, about a man standing with his hand on a 5-year-old's shoulder, not demanding anything, not performing, just present, waiting with the particular patience of someone who had decided that showing up was the point regardless of what showing up produced. Aldous had spent 40 years in rooms with people who wanted things from him. He had become fluent in the language of angles and leverage and positioned patience, the waiting that was really a form of pressure. What he had watched from the window was not that. What he had watched was a man who had driven to a gate that kept him out and stood there anyway, not because he expected it to open, but because leaving was not something he was willing to do. Aldous understood in the particular way that understanding arrives when you have been avoiding it long enough that your avoidance mechanism finally exhausts itself, what that cost. He understood it because he had once been a man who stayed. Before the company became the company. Before Miriam's absence created a vacuum he had filled with work, because work was the only thing that didn't require him to feel the shape of what was missing. He had a decision to make. Not the one about Beckett Merritt. That decision had already been made for him by a 5-year-old at an iron gate, and a daughter who had looked at him in a hallway with the expression of someone who had stopped pretending. The decision was about what came next. Whether he was going to continue in the direction he had been traveling for 6 years, which was away from everything that cost him something to feel, or whether he was going to do the thing that Beckett Merritt apparently did without calculation or strategy, turn around and go back. He sat with this for a long time. Outside the gate was empty now. Beckett had taken Wren home because that was what you did when it was a school night and the gate didn't open, and you had a daughter who needed dinner and the story about the rabbit and someone to perform the flashlight inspection for the specific monster under the left side of her bed. The driveway was dark. The estate was quiet in the way that large, expensive spaces are quiet when they are doing exactly what they were designed to do, which was insulate the people inside them from the world outside. Aldous looked at the photograph one more time. Then he set it down, took off the reading glasses, and made a decision that had no leverage point and no optimized outcome and no prepared language. Only the plain intention of a man who had finally arrived at the end of what running could accomplish. He would go to her. Not tonight. Nora was at her window watching a driveway, and the conversation they needed to have required more than a hallway and a closed gate between them. But the decision was made in the dark of Miriam's room, with the reading glasses on the nightstand and the photograph of a man who used to laugh, and it was the first decision in 6 years that Aldous Harlan had made from something other than the management of his own fear. He did not yet know what the going would look like. He did not yet have the words. What he had was the fact of the decision, which was, he understood now, where every real thing had to begin, not with the right language or the correct approach, but with the plain choice to stop moving in the wrong direction. Outside the window, the November night had finished arriving. The stars above Westfield Hills were obscured by cloud cover which suited the evening. Some nights did not require stars. Some nights only required the dark and the quiet, and a man sitting in his dead wife's chair finally allowing himself to be afraid of the right things. He set the photograph face up on the nightstand. He had been keeping it face down for 6 years, not in a drawer, not hidden, but angled away from the room as if it were something to be filed rather than seen. He set it face up now so that the laughing man at the picnic table was looking at the room rather than away from it. It was a small thing. But small things, he was beginning to understand, were where the real work lived, in the daily, ordinary, unglamorous practice of choosing to face the things you had been facing away from. Beckett Merritt had apparently known this for 6 years. Nora had known it and been waiting for him to learn it. Wren, who was 5 years old and had pressed her face between the bars of his gate because she had decided that some things were worth pressing your face through iron bars for, had been showing it to him from the driveway. He was a slow student. He thought, finally ready to begin. The letter had been in her nightstand drawer for 8 months. Not hidden, just placed face down beneath whatever book she was currently reading, which changed every few weeks, which meant the letter had been underneath 7 different books since February. She had developed a practice of not thinking about it that was entirely different from forgetting it existed. Forgetting would have required no effort. The practice required daily redirection, a small conscious act of turning away, and it had been manageable until the night Wren's voice came through the window and something in the manageable quality of her life cracked open at its seams. She found the letter that same night. Not by looking, by reaching for the novel on top of it and having her hand stop on the envelope before she could redirect herself. The return address read North Carolina College of Art and Design Admissions Office, and the date was February, and the letter inside began with the words she had read once and placed face down and not read again. Dear Ms. Harlan, it is with great pleasure that we offer you admission to our graduate program in Art History and Visual Studies. She had applied in October. She had been accepted in February. She had declined in February in under 10 minutes, which was how she knew the decision had come from fear rather than reason. The things she made from fear were always fast. She had told herself the campus was too large, the apartment situation too uncertain, the logistics of a life outside the estate's organized accessibility too complicated to hold alongside the wanting. What she had not told herself, because telling yourself true things required a particular courage, she had been rationing carefully, was that she had declined because she did not yet believe she was worth the complication. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She thought about Beckett, who had told her she made his days better in the plain voice of a man who meant exactly what he said and nothing more elaborate. She thought about Wren pressing her face between iron bars, because she had decided at 6 years old that some things were worth pressing your face through iron bars for. She thought about 8 months of placing things face down under other things and calling it living. She went to find her father. He was not in his study. The study was dark, the monitors off, for once the leather chair empty. She found him in Miriam's room, which she had not entered in 3 years, and which he was sitting in with the lights off, and the small lamp by the door casting its amber light across his face when she turned it on. He was wearing reading glasses she had never seen him wear in front of anyone. He was holding the wooden frame, the Father's Day photograph, the picnic table, the laughing with both hands in his lap, the careful grip of someone holding something that might break if handled carelessly, or might break him if he put it down. He looked up when the light came on. He did not move to hide the glasses. He did not compose his face before she could see it uncomposed, which was the first true difference between this moment and every moment they had inhabited together in the past 4 years. She came fully into the room and positioned her chair beside his, close enough that the lamp held them both in the same amber circle, and she told him what she needed to tell him, not with the anger of their previous confrontation, which had been real and warranted, but was not the language in which the necessary thing could be said. What she needed required a different register, not accusation, which he could fortify against, but plain fact, which he could not. When I woke up in that hospital, Nora said, her voice finding a steadiness that surprised her as she heard it from the inside. I wasn't afraid of the diagnosis. I wasn't afraid of the wheelchair or what it meant for the rest of my life. I was afraid of lying there and understanding before any doctor said a word that the person I most needed to walk through that door probably wouldn't. She watched his face, which was doing something unfamiliar, receiving rather than processing. You came. I know that now. But you were in the hallway, and I was in the room, and that hallway has been between us every single day since. Aldous set the photograph on the nightstand. The reading glasses stayed on his face. He was quiet long enough that the lamp's small flame adjusted to some change in the current and then steadied. And when he spoke, the words came without the prepared quality she had learned to recognize in his voice over decades, the cadence of a man who has composed his sentences before delivering them. I could not fix it. The admission arrived stripped of everything. 30 years of building systems, solving problems, finding the leverage point in every situation, and I stood in that hospital with every resource I had ever accumulated, and none of it could touch what happened to you. So I kept adding to the list. More specialists, better equipment. I kept adding because adding felt like action, and action felt better than standing in that room knowing I had failed the most important test I would ever face. Nora looked at her father and saw for the first time, without the filter of her own wound, what Opal had described and what the 4 years of managed distance had made invisible. Not a cold man, but a frightened one. Not a man who had stopped loving her, but a man who had translated that love into the only currency he had left when the real currency of presence became too costly to spend. "I know why," she said. "I've known for a while, but knowing why doesn't close the hallway, Dad. The hallway is still there." He nodded without argument, which was itself a form of change. Then she placed the acceptance letter on the arm of his chair. He looked at the return address. She watched him reconstruct the timeline, when she had applied, when she had been accepted, when she had declined, and she watched him understand what the 8 months between acceptance and this night said about the interior of the life he had been managing from a distance. He picked the letter up. He read it with the reading glasses still on his face, carefully, in the way he read documents that required full attention. When he set it down, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which was hung over the back of the chair, and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and held it in the amber light, and she saw architectural drawings, floor plans with accessibility notations, doorway measurements, the specific turning radius of a standard wheelchair marked in precise increments along a corridor. At the top of the drawings, in small institutional type, North Carolina College of Art and Design, Visual Arts Building, Accessibility Renovation Phase 2. She stared at the drawings. She looked at her father. "The school contacted me about a facilities donation the same month your declination was processed," he said. "I made the donation contingent on specific improvements. I didn't tell you because I knew how it would appear: another transaction, another problem managed from a distance, his money instead of himself showing up again." He refolded the drawings along their original creases with the deliberate care of a man performing the last small task before saying the hardest thing. "I couldn't fix your spine. There was a door I could fix. So I fixed the door and said nothing and watched you decline a letter you had earned, and I have been sitting with that for 8 months. The door he had fixed in secret, with no announcement, no leverage, no visible return on investment. The one action in 4 years that had looked nothing like the management of a problem, and everything like the love of a father who had lost the language for love and was trying in the only dialect still available to him to say something true. Nora felt something release in her chest that had been structural for a long time. Not collapsing, releasing the way a door opens when the right key is finally used. She crossed the small distance between them and put her arms around her father, and he held on with the urgency of someone who has been waiting for permission and is not going to spend a single second of it cautiously. His voice against her hair, rough and unmanaged. "I am sorry, Nora. I have carried the sorry for so long it stopped feeling like a feeling and became something I simply lived around. But I am sorry. For the hallway. For every day the hallway cost you." She did not say it was fine. It wasn't fine, and he didn't need the false comfort of hearing that it was. She said, "I know, Dad, I know." And that was the beginning of the architecture of something that might, with daily practice and time and the ordinary work of showing up, become enough. She left the estate 40 minutes later. The rain had started while she was in Miriam's room, a steady November rain, cold enough to feel serious, the kind that soaks through a jacket in 3 minutes and does not apologize for it. She did not go back for a heavier coat. She pushed her chair through it, her arms working the wet wheels, the effort of the incline settling into her shoulders with the specific weight of physical work that has a destination. She was not performing the rain. She was simply moving through it because the thing she was moving toward was more important than being dry. Opal had left the door unlocked. The sign in the window read, "Closed," but the latch gave when Nora pulled, and the bakery inside was dim and warm, the display case lights making the glass glow the overhead ones off the space existing in the comfortable in-between of a place that never fully releases its welcome. Opal was at the back counter with a mug and her crossword, which she did in pen, and she looked up when the door opened and took in the wet hair and the damp jacket and the wheel tracks on the hardwood floor without comment. She retrieved a towel from behind the counter, a real towel cotton warm from the folded stack, and wrapped it around Nora's shoulders. Then she went and put the kettle on because some forms of care are best expressed through the reliable preparation of something warm. Beckett and Wren were at the corner table. The corner table with the iron legs and the nick in the edge, the same table where 22 candles had burned themselves to stubs on a Tuesday in October, the table that held the beginning of all of it. They had come back here after the gate, which Nora would learn later from Beckett, because when you cannot move forward and cannot stand still, you return to the place where the thing started, and you wait on the chance that the thing knows to find you there. Wren covered the distance between them at the full speed of a 6-year-old who has been worried for 4 days and is now relieved and has no interest in moderating this relief for the sake of anyone's composure. Her arms went around Nora's neck and her face pressed into Nora's wet hair, and she held on with the total physical conviction of a child who has decided this is where she is going to be for the foreseeable future and does not require anyone's permission. Beckett stood. He crossed the room at his own pace, the unhurried walk of a man who has learned that arrival matters more than speed. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face in the way he always did, comprehensive, undeflected, wanting to see all of it. Then he reached down and took her hands from her lap, where they had retreated in the automatic self-containment she defaulted to under pressure, and held them in his. His hands were warm, rough at the knuckle, entirely steady. "You're soaked," he said. "I'm choosing." The words arrived steadier than the interior of her felt, which was its own form of courage. "For the first time in 4 years, I'm choosing. You, Wren, whatever we're building. My father can do whatever he decides to do, and I will deal with it, but I am done letting someone else determine what I'm capable of wanting." He held her hands and looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and he made no attempt to address this. "Then we deal with it together. That is the only plan I have, and it is the only one I need." Wren, still attached to Nora's shoulder, produced from her jacket pocket, where she apparently stored things of importance alongside lint and a flattened hair tie, the origami crane, the one Nora had kept on her nightstand, which Wren had at some point during one of the estate visits quietly taken and kept safe with the matter-of-fact competence of a person who identified what needed protecting and protected it. "I kept it," Wren said with the complete seriousness of someone reporting a mission successfully completed. "I knew you'd want it back." The door opened. Aldous Harlan came in from the rain, and he looked nothing like himself. He looked like a 60-year-old man who had walked 6 blocks without a car, without a coat suited to the weather, without the 20 layers of professional insulation that usually stood between him and the unmanaged world. His suit was dark with water. His hair had abandoned its arrangement somewhere on the 2nd block. He had left the estate on foot, which he had not done in memory, because the walking had been the point, the physical act of placing himself into the discomfort, rather than dispatching someone else to manage it. He stood inside the door and looked at his daughter, and then at Beckett, and then at Wren, who had detached from Nora's shoulder, and was now standing in the center of the room, regarding him with the full, serious, unhurried attention she gave to things that deserved it. Wren walked toward him. She stopped at a reasonable distance and looked up at him with the expression she wore when she was delivering information she considered important and wanted to be certain was received correctly. "You're her daddy," she said, her voice carrying the particular weight of a child being entirely literal. "But you make her cry. Not the okay kind of crying, the kind that means something is wrong." She paused, consulting whatever internal checklist governed these assessments. "My daddy says family means showing up, not just paying up." He explained the difference. She was simply telling him the truth in the clearest possible language, the way children do, before the world teaches them to soften it. Beckett stood, not aggressively fully claiming the space with his presence rather than his posture. "Mr. Harlan, I sat down at a birthday cake because your daughter was alone on her birthday. That is the entire story. I'm not a threat and I'm not an angle. I'm a man who thought no one should celebrate alone, and I'd make the same decision tomorrow." His voice carried no performance, no rehearsed confrontation, just the fact of it, plain and undecorated. "She is not a problem requiring management. She is a person who deserves to live in the world." Aldous stood with the rain still coming off his jacket, the amber light catching the lines in his face that had deepened considerably in the 6 years since Miriam and he looked at Beckett Merritt. This carpenter with the warm hands and the steady eyes, and the daughter who noticed the quiet ones, and he saw what he had failed to see in 43 pages of investigative reporting. He saw a man who had lost something enormous and had chosen every day since to be present anyway, who had driven to a gate that wouldn't open and stood there without demanding it open, who had returned to a bakery with his daughter because the alternative was leaving, and leaving was not in his vocabulary. Aldous crossed the room. He went to Nora and he found a chair, and he sat down in it at the level of her wheelchair. Something that required no instruction, that he simply did as if some arrangement in him had shifted, and the new configuration knew what the old one hadn't. He looked at his daughter's face, wet from the rain and carrying the specific expression of a person who has come through something and arrived somewhere real, and he said the only thing that remained after everything else had been exhausted. "Tell me how to stay. I have never known how. I want to learn." Nora looked at her father, the man who had been in the hallway, who had fixed the door in secret, who had walked 6 blocks in the rain, because some gestures cannot be delegated, and she felt the full complexity of him for the first time without needing to simplify it. Not a villain, not a solved problem. A frightened man who had run toward control because he didn't know how to run toward the people he loved, and who was sitting in a bakery chair asking his daughter to teach him something most people learned by 40. "You start with today," she said. "You don't repair 4 years in one night. You show up today and then tomorrow, and you keep doing it until it becomes who you are instead of something you're trying to be." She reached out and put her hand over his on the chair arm, and his hand turned beneath hers and held on with the grip of a man who has been drowning quietly for years and has finally decided to reach for the surface. "And you let Beckett teach you to make something with your hands because you need to understand what it feels like to build something instead of buying it." Aldous looked at Beckett with the complicated expression of a powerful man in the early stages of understanding that the thing he most needed could not be acquired through any skill he currently possessed. Beckett met the look with the steadiness that was simply his nature, not forgiving, yet not fully but open in the careful way of someone who extends openness because it's the right practice regardless of whether it's the easy one. Then Wren walked back to Aldous and looked at him with the clinical concern of a small person who has decided to take on a significant project and wants to begin correctly. She studied him for a moment. Then, "Okay, but you have to hug Miss Nora first. A real one, not the handshake kind." The laughter that moved through Ember and Crumb was disproportionate to the immediate cause, and all the more necessary for it the release of people who have been holding something heavy and have been given permission to set it down. Opal laughed from behind the counter. Beckett laughed with his whole face. Nora laughed and felt her eyes fill simultaneously, which was the most honest thing she had done in a room with her father in 4 years. Aldous stood. He bent down and held his daughter, and it was real. Not the managed contact of the past 4 years, but the full weight of it, the acknowledgement of everything held between two people who had failed each other in the ways that fear teaches people to fail the ones they love most. She felt him exhale against her shoulder long and releasing like a structure finally settling on its foundation after years of resisting the ground beneath it. Opal put the kettle on. She brought the almond cake from the case. Thursday's cake, the one she made because she liked making it, and cut 5 pieces without ceremony, and sat down with them because there were 5 people in this room, and that was the arithmetic, and she had spent 27 years making her bakery a place where the arithmetic included everyone present. They stayed 2 hours. It was not seamless. Aldous and Beckett were careful with each other in the way of people who have good reasons for caution and are choosing against that grain to try. There were silences not yet filled by ease. There were sentences that found new directions midway through. But Wren taught Nora to fold a new crane from a paper napkin and talked about the caterpillar from school that had become a chrysalis, which she considered among the most significant recent developments in the natural world. And Beckett watched Nora's face in the amber light with the expression of a man who has been given something he stopped expecting and is not taking a single moment of it for granted. Aldous ate his piece of almond cake. He did not look at his phone once. For a man who had structured his entire adult life around the management of what his attention was directed toward, this was a form of revolution so small it would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know what it cost. 1 year later, Ember and Crumb held a wedding. Opal had closed the bakery for the afternoon. A hand-lettered sign in the window read, "Closed for something that started here. Back tomorrow." The overhead lights were on, supplemented by string lights that Beckett and 2 of his woodworking colleagues had installed along the ceiling the previous evening, warm and low, and filling the room with the color of something that had no precise name, but felt like what the word celebrate means when it is meant without reservation. The guest list was small and specific. Beckett's fellow craftsmen, who had become the kind of friends that physical work alongside someone produces substantial, reliable, not given to unnecessary speech. A handful of Nora's old friends who had returned over the past year, drawn back by a version of her that was more fully present than the managed one they had previously known. Opal and her husband Douglas, a retired electrician with the same quality of quiet steadiness as his wife, and Aldous, who had arrived 40 minutes early and rearranged the chairs without being asked, ensuring the aisle was wide enough for Nora's wheelchair, measuring it twice with his hand before he was satisfied. Nora wore Miriam's dress. 3 weeks of alteration had made it exactly right, a gown made for another woman in another decade that had found its second life here, pooling around the chair in a way that looked like intention rather than accommodation, which was itself the truest thing that could be said about how Nora Harlan moved through the world now. Miriam had married in November. Her daughter married in November. The symmetry was understood by everyone and mentioned by no one, because some things are most powerful held in silence. Wren wore yellow, her sole and non-negotiable aesthetic contribution, and carried her basket of white flowers with the gravity of someone performing a sacred function, which was exactly what she believed she was doing. She had practiced the walk for 2 weeks. She had explained to Beckett on multiple occasions that the flower girl set the emotional tone for everything that followed, and he had agreed with full sincerity because he suspected it was probably true. Aldous walked beside Nora's wheelchair down the aisle. Not behind it, pushing beside it, his hand resting on her shoulder at the angle that had developed naturally over 12 months of physical therapy, attended exercises, assisted the daily practice of proximity that had rebuilt imperfectly and durably what the hallway had dismantled. His eyes were wet before they reached the front of the room. He did not manage this. Beckett was waiting near the counter where Opal had stood for 27 years, and his face, when Nora came into his full view, was the face of a man receiving something he had stopped expecting the world to offer. Not surprised, because he had shown up at the gate and returned to the bakery and sat in the dark and chosen every day to keep going. But the arrival was still something. The arrival was always something. Opal officiated with a single piece of paper she didn't consult once. She spoke about beginnings, about how this room had been a beginning twice, first on a Tuesday in October and now on a Saturday in November, and about how everything they were celebrating had been built from one question and one answer, and nothing more elaborate than that. Beckett held Nora's hands in both of his. His vows were not long. He had written them in the workshop on a Thursday night in the yellow lamp circle, and they carried in them the specific texture of words composed in honest solitude. Nora, you've taught me that showing up isn't the heroic thing, it's the ordinary thing. The daily thing that becomes who you are if you do it long enough. I promise to do the ordinary thing every day for every year. I promise to see you, not your limitations. I promise to push when you need pushing and step back when you need space, and never once confuse taking care of you with deciding for you. Nora had written hers in the new apartment near the college, the one with the wide corridors and the kitchen counter at the right height, and the east-facing window that caught the morning light at the angle Hopper would have recognized immediately. She had written them with the acceptance letter on the desk beside her. The real one, the one for January enrollment, framed now and already hung on the wall above the small white oak shelf Aldous had made in Beckett's workshop on his second visit. It was not technically accomplished work. The proportions were slightly uneven, the finish rougher than it should have been. It was the first thing he had ever built with his hands, and it held the origami crane and the Father's Day photograph and the acceptance letter, and it was the most important piece of furniture in the apartment. She said, "Beckett, you and Wren didn't wait for me to be ready. You sat down at my table before I knew I needed anyone to. You gave me something I had stopped believing was available, the experience of being seen without being fixed. I promise to keep choosing this. Every day. I promise that the ordinary thing will be enough, because the ordinary thing is the whole of everything." Wren, who had maintained professional composure through the vows with considerable effort, could not hold it through the final sentence. She cried in the specific way of a 6-year-old trying not to cry and failing, which produced a sound that broke the sacred moment into something better. Pure relief released as laughter, filling the room with the particular joy that only arrives when the tension of the long road finally resolves. Aldous laughed. The same laugh from the photograph, the unguarded one, the one from the picnic table, the one Miriam had caught when he didn't know he was being seen. It arrived from somewhere below the architecture of the life he had built on top of it, and it was real, and Nora heard it and recognized it from childhood, from before everything, and felt the distance close in a way that no single gesture could have accomplished. Later, after the music had wound down and the guests had moved toward the door, and Opal was beginning the familiar closing work of her bakery, Beckett wheeled Nora outside for a moment of air. The November night was cold and clear. The street quiet in the way streets go quiet after 10, and the stars were visible in a way they rarely were in the city, some accident of atmosphere and cloudlessness that had temporarily cleared the usual veil. He brought a piece of wedding cake. He handed it to her with the deliberate quality of someone performing a ritual that had accumulated meaning since the first time it was performed. "No one should eat cake alone," he said. And the 6 words carried in them the full distance from that Tuesday afternoon in October to this Saturday night in November, the whole geography of what had been lost and found and built and chosen. Nora took the fork. She looked up at the stars. She thought about 22 candles burning down to stubs while she sat alone and made the smallest possible wish. She thought about how the universe, which owed her nothing, had sent her a man with a craft store bag and a daughter who noticed the quiet ones, had sent her a father learning late and imperfectly to stay, had sent her in the end herself. She looked at Beckett beside her on the step, their shoulders touching, his face tipped up toward the same stars, and she felt the full weight of the ordinary life they were building. Not the dramatic version, not the version that resolved cleanly into silence, but the real version, which would have complications and difficult weeks, and the daily practice of choosing each other past the point where choosing felt easy. She felt the weight of it and found it exactly right, exactly what she had wished for, and so much more. Inside the bakery, Wren was explaining something to Aldous with the comprehensive attention she brought to topics she considered important. Through the glass, Nora could see her father listening, actually listening, face angled toward the child, responses arriving at the right intervals. Learning the practice that had always been available to him, that had always been the whole point. "I'll never be alone again," Nora said. Not a question. A fact stated for the first time from the inside of its truth, rather than the outside of its longing. Beckett shook his head. He reached over and placed his hand gently on hers, and she turned her hand beneath his and held on. "Never," he said. "That's the only promise that matters, and I've already been keeping it." The November air held them both, and inside the amber light of ember and crumb, the ordinary world did its ordinary work, a father learning to listen, a child teaching him how a bakery that had held a beginning, now holding what the beginning had become. All of it built from one question asked at a corner table on a Tuesday afternoon by a man with warm hands and his daughter's good sense to a woman alone at a birthday cake who had not yet learned that the wish she was about to make had already been answered by the people walking through the door.